It was December 24th, and for the first time, I wasn't celebrating Christmas with my family. Work deadlines had kept me tied up, and the flights home were too expensive to justify the short trip. Instead, I spent the day wrapping up last-minute projects and trying to distract myself from the empty quiet of my apartment. It wasn't a bad place, a small two-bedroom rental in a modest suburban complex, but that night, the silence felt heavier, more oppressive. I had done my best to make the holiday feel festive. I set up a small artificial tree in the corner of my living room and strung it with cheap lights I found on sale. I even hung a wreath on the door, though the artificial pine needles were already shedding. By the time evening rolled around, I decided to treat myself to a Christmas movie marathon with hot cocoa. At about 8 p.m., just as the snow began falling, I heard the sound of faint footsteps outside my door. My first thought was that it was one of my neighbors coming home late, but the steps didn't seem to pass by. Instead, they stopped right in front of my apartment. I muted the TV and listened closely. The knock was light, almost hesitant, but insistent enough to make me pause. I hadn't ordered anything, and I certainly wasn't expecting visitors. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man standing on my porch. He was wearing a long coat and a knitted hat, and his face was partially obscured by the hood. Something about the way he stood, too still, too rigid, made my stomach knot. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, my hand hovering over the lock. The man didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the peephole, and I swear it felt like he was staring directly into my eyes. "Sorry to bother you," he said finally, his voice low and calm. "I'm locked out of my car. Can I borrow your phone?" Every instinct in my body screamed not to open the door. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket. "What's the number?" "I can call someone for you." There was a long pause. Too long. Then he laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Don't worry about it," he said, stepping back. "I'll figure it out." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the falling snow. I stood frozen for a moment before double-checking that my door was locked. Something about the encounter left me rattled, but I tried to convince myself it was harmless. Maybe he really was just a stranded motorist. Hours passed, and I managed to distract myself with more movies. By midnight, I was ready to call it a night. As I was shutting off the lights, I caught a glimpse of something through the blinds. Someone was standing on the sidewalk across the street, staring directly at my apartment. The man. He was perfectly still, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I knew it was him. Panic surged through me as I quickly dropped the blinds and backed away. My mind raced with what to do. Should I call the police? Was I overreacting? Maybe he was just passing by. But deep down, I knew better. A few minutes later, I heard the footsteps again. They were heavier this time, crunching through the snow as they approached my door. Then came the knock, louder and more deliberate than before. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but as the call connected, the knocking stopped. I crept to the window and peeked out through a small gap in the blinds. The porch was empty. The dispatcher assured me that an officer would be sent to check the area. I waited, my heart pounding, glancing nervously at the windows and doors. When the police arrived, they searched the complex but found no sign of the man. They told me to keep my doors locked and call again if he returned. I barely slept that night, every creak and shadow sending my nerves into overdrive. By morning, I thought the nightmare was over. But when I stepped outside to head to work, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the porch was a single Christmas ornament, a small, cracked glass bulb. Attached to it was a piece of paper with 4 words scrawled in shaky handwriting: "I'll see you soon." The police were called again, but there wasn't much they could do without further evidence. They suggested it could have been a prank, though the officer's tone made it clear he didn't believe that. I stayed with a friend for the next few nights, unable to face the thought of being alone. Even now, I can't look at Christmas ornaments without feeling a pang of fear. Whoever that man was, whatever he wanted, he knew where I lived. And every holiday season, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. It was a few days before Christmas, and I had just moved into a small house in a quiet neighborhood. The timing wasn't ideal, unpacking during the holidays felt chaotic, but I was determined to make the place feel festive. I set up a tall Christmas tree by the living room window, its twinkling lights visible from the street. My neighbors had done the same, their homes glowing with the warm colors of the season. It felt like a perfect start to a new chapter. The first few nights in the house were uneventful. I spent my time arranging furniture, hanging ornaments, and sipping hot cocoa by the fire. The neighborhood was peaceful, almost too quiet at times, but I found the stillness comforting. That all changed on December 23rd. It started with a package. I found it on my porch that morning, a small box wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. I hadn't ordered anything, so I assumed it was a gift from a neighbor. Curious, I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a single Christmas ornament, a small, intricately painted figurine of a snowman holding a lantern. It was beautiful but strangely old-fashioned, as if it belonged to a different era. There was no note or card, just the ornament nestled in a bed of tissue paper. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to hang it on the tree. It looked perfect among the other ornaments, its lantern catching the light and casting tiny reflections on the wall. That night, as I sat on the couch reading, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, like the crunch of footsteps on snow. I glanced out the window but saw nothing unusual, just the empty street and the soft glow of Christmas lights. I told myself it was just a stray animal or the wind stirring the snow. But as the hours went by, the sound continued. It was intermittent, like someone was pacing just out of sight. Around midnight, I finally worked up the nerve to check. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting at my skin. The street was empty, the neighborhood silent. But then I noticed something strange. In the snow, just a few feet from my porch, were footprints. They were large and deep, leading from the sidewalk to the house. But they didn't stop at the porch. They veered to the side, disappearing around the corner. My heart raced as I followed the trail. The footprints led to the living room window, where they stopped abruptly. There were no tracks leading away. It was as if whoever had made them had stood there, staring into the house, before vanishing. I quickly went back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was just some kid playing a prank, though the thought did little to calm my nerves. I double-checked all the locks and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The snowman ornament was gone. I searched the entire house, thinking it might have fallen off the tree or rolled under a piece of furniture. But it was nowhere to be found. The empty space on the tree where it had hung seemed to mock me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump, my mind conjuring images of shadowy figures lurking just beyond the door. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved that nothing else had happened. That relief didn't last long. The next day, another package arrived. This one was larger, wrapped in the same plain brown paper. My hands trembled as I opened it, dread pooling in my stomach. Inside was another ornament, this time, a figurine of a little girl holding a candle. Like the snowman, it was beautifully detailed but unnervingly old-fashioned. And like before, there was no note or explanation. I didn't hang this one on the tree. Instead, I set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it, wondering who could be leaving these gifts. Was it the same person who had been outside my window? And if so, why? That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. They circled the house, crunching through the snow in a slow, methodical pattern. I peeked through the blinds but saw no one. My heart pounded as I debated whether to call the police, but what would I say? That someone was walking around my house. It sounded ridiculous. Then I heard a knock at the back door. It was soft but insistent, the kind of knock that demanded attention. I crept to the door, my breath shallow, and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I stayed up all night, clutching a kitchen knife and jumping at every sound. When morning came, I found a third package on the porch. My hand shook as I opened it, revealing yet another ornament, a man in a top hat carrying a sack of toys. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, as if someone was watching my every move. I decided to spend the night at a friend's house, packing a bag and leaving as quickly as I could. But as I was locking the door, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps on snow. I spun around, my heart racing. At the edge of the yard, just beyond the glow of the streetlights, stood a figure. They were tall and motionless, their face obscured by the shadows. My blood ran cold as I realized they were holding something. It was the snowman ornament. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I jumped into my car and drove away, not stopping until I reached my friend's house. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow, like some absurd story I had made up. When I returned to the house the next day, everything was gone. The ornaments, the footprints, even the packages, they had all disappeared. The only sign that anything had happened was the empty spot on the tree where the snowman had hung. I moved out a few months later, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was behind the ornaments. But every Christmas, I think about that quiet house and the strange gifts left on my porch. And I wonder if someone else is finding them now. I've always loved Christmas for its traditions, bright lights, festive songs, and cozy nights by the fire. But one Christmas, a few years ago, forever changed the way I look at the holiday season. It was the year my family decided to spend Christmas in the countryside, renting a secluded house at the edge of a small, picturesque village. The house was beautiful, with a rustic charm that looked straight out of a holiday card. It sat at the base of a large hill, crowned by an old church with a bell tower that overlooked the entire valley. The villagers told us that the church had been closed for decades, but its bell still rang on Christmas Eve, a tradition kept alive by the local choir. It sounded quaint, even magical, so we eagerly looked forward to hearing it. If only we had known what was coming. The first couple of days were idyllic. My parents and I spent the mornings exploring the village's snow-dusted streets and the evenings baking cookies by the roaring fireplace. The neighbors were friendly, though oddly reserved. They were polite but kept their distance, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, as my mom prepared dinner, I decided to take a walk up the hill to see the old church. The path was steep and slippery with fresh snow, but the view from the top was worth it. The church was a towering stone structure, its walls weathered by time. Its bell tower rose high above the trees, the iron bell visible through the open arches. The churchyard was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I tried the heavy wooden doors, but they were locked. Peering through the frosted windows, I could just make out rows of dusty pews and the faint outline of an altar. Something about the place felt off. I couldn't explain it, but I left quickly, the weight of the church's looming presence following me down the hill. That night, as we gathered around the fireplace, the first bell rang. It was deep and resonant, its sound echoing through the valley like a call from another world. My dad smiled and said, "That's the choir getting ready for midnight." The sound was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. It felt too perfect, too precise, as if it weren't coming from a rusty old bell but from something else entirely. At 11:30, we bundled up and decided to walk up the hill to hear the choir. The path was darker than before, the snow glistening faintly under the moonlight. As we climbed, the bells continued to ring at regular intervals, growing louder and more melodic. By the time we reached the top, the air was thick with the sound of singing. The choir's voices were ethereal, unlike anything I'd ever heard. They sang in perfect harmony, their tones so pure it made my chest ache. The words weren't in English, or any language I recognized, but the melody was hauntingly beautiful. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the night with an almost hypnotic pull. The church doors were still locked, but the windows now glowed faintly with a golden light. My parents looked at each other, confused. "Maybe it's a recording," my mom said, though her voice wavered. "Or someone's playing a trick," my dad added, though he didn't sound convinced. I approached one of the windows, pressing my hands against the cold glass. Inside, the pews were filled with people. They were dressed in dark robes, their faces obscured by shadows. They sat perfectly still, their heads bowed as the choir's song continued to echo through the night. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "There's someone in there," I whispered. My dad frowned. "That's not possible. The place has been abandoned for years." The singing grew louder, the notes weaving into a crescendo that sent chills down my spine. Then, without warning, the bell rang again, cutting through the melody like a sharp blade. And the lights inside the church went out. For a moment, the hill was silent, the darkness pressing in around us. My mom grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "We should go," she said, her voice trembling. As we turned to leave, the singing started again, fainter this time but still audible. It was coming from behind us. I looked over my shoulder and froze. Figures were emerging from the churchyard, their forms barely visible against the snow. They moved slowly, almost gliding, their dark robes blending into the shadows. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their eyes on us. "Run," my dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. We stumbled down the hill, the snow making every step treacherous. The singing grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind us. I didn't dare look back, too afraid of what I might see. By the time we reached the house, I was gasping for breath, my heart pounding. We locked the doors and windows, drawing the curtains tightly. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. We stayed awake all night, huddled together in the living room. When dawn finally broke, we ventured outside, half expecting to see footprints in the snow. But the path to the church was untouched, the fresh snow pristine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I climbed the hill one last time. The church looked as it had before, silent, dark, and locked. But when I walked around to the back, I found something that made my stomach drop. In the snow, carved as if by a single finger, was a single word: stay. We left the village that same day, cutting our trip short. My parents refused to talk about what had happened, dismissing it as some elaborate prank. But I know what I saw, and what I heard. Every Christmas since, I can't hear the sound of bells without feeling a knot of dread. Whatever was up on that hill wasn't a choir. And whoever, or whatever, was inside that church didn't want us to leave.